What if the past we know is only the past that survived? What if the story begins not with what was said, but with what was buried before anyone could remember or forget? Here's a pit. Not deep, not hidden, just a depression in the ground, surrounded by trees that have no memory of what came before them. It holds bones, not scattered but layered, not recent but not quite fossil. Something between presence and absence. The kind of finding that makes silence feel heavier than noise. No inscription, no structure, no myth that remembers this place. It isn't marked on old maps, nor whispered in village legend. It simply is quiet, unresolved, and strangely patient, as if it's been waiting not to be found, but to be understood. And still it resists. We dig, not with shovels first, but with questions. Why here? Why them? And perhaps most of all, when? The bones seem older than the nearby settlements. Older than the road that cuts a winding path through the hills. Older than the story we've told ourselves about this region, this culture, this chapter of time. Maybe not older in years, but older in weight. In the way they hold stillness. In the way they seem unclaimed, as though no one ever came looking. There are no weapons among them. No trinkets. No talismans to ward off time or usher the dead into a story. They lie without identity, but not without meaning. Some are children, their teeth just forming. Others are adults, curled strangely, as if sleep had taken them before explanation could follow. We try to date them. Carbon whispers numbers in half-lives and decay. Oxygen isotopes murmur of water once drunk, rivers long dried. Strontium in the teeth traces migrations across bedrock, speaking in the slow language of geology. But even science, elegant and exacting, cannot fill in everything. It outlines the shape of the unknown, but leaves the interior dark. Perhaps this is not a chapter in a book we've read. Perhaps it is a torn page from a different volume, one we never knew existed. A story parallel to our own, never crossing, never remembered, but real all the same. Could it be that history doesn't just forget, it selects? That memory, like erosion, is shaped by weather, by terrain, by what is exposed and what is buried too deeply to reach. The pit was not sealed. It was merely overlooked. And time has a way of protecting what it does not reveal. There are moments in that quiet place when the wind seems to move differently, softer, as if aware of something beneath. Not haunted, but aware. A presence that is not presence. The echo of lives lived, yet lost without punctuation. We like to think we know how civilizations end. Collapse, war, disease, flood. But what if some don't end in noise, but in stillness? Not because they failed, but because they faded gently, imperceptibly, like the last trace of warmth in cooling stone. There are no ruins here. No temples. No burnt layers of charcoal and ash. Just the ground and the bones. A single page torn from forgotten history, dropped into the earth without title or translation. Maybe this wasn't a city. Maybe it wasn't even a community as we understand it. Maybe it was something quieter, a gathering, a migration, a hidden belief. Maybe these people buried themselves here for reasons we will never know. Or maybe they were never buried at all. Just left, surrendered, returned. What if this pit is not a crime scene, not a mass grave, but a monument? A ritual? A moment we cannot interpret because we lack the symbols to do so? The temptation is to name them, to fill in the gaps. But what if that impulse to assign, to decode, is what fractures the truth further? What if they are unknowable not because of time, but because they were never meant to be known? Sometimes we forget that forgetting is part of the human experience. That not all silence is a flaw in the record. Some silences are the record, a choice made long before we arrived. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? The land folds gently here, like an old blanket long left untouched. The grass leans inward toward a shallow wound, a depression that does not belong but does not protest. It simply is. There are no stones arranged in reverence, no markings scorched into the soil, no pathway leading in, no outfittings, no footprints. Only the wind, and the way it seems to slow as it crosses the dip. It shouldn't be here, not because of what it contains, but because of what surrounds it. No nearby village, no ruins of collapsed architecture or burnt wood, no trace of life lived in proximity to death. This place has the quietness of something bypassed, not by accident, but by design. And that silence is perhaps the most eloquent thing it holds. We call it a pit, but that word is too rough, too indifferent. It is more like a pause in the earth's breath, a place where the ground exhales just slightly and reveals what it meant to keep hidden. A soft cavity rimmed in wild growth, without purpose or name. It waits, not for us to ask questions, but for us to listen. And when we do, the land offers only more mystery. Bones, yes. Dozens, maybe more. Children, adults, spines curled and limbs folded in no clear order. But they're not crushed or flung, not burned or broken. They're settled, like leaves fallen in still water. The arrangement feels gentle. It feels intentional. But by whom? And for what reason? Who digs a hole for the dead and never returns? Who chooses a place so distant from the paths of the living? Not just in space, but in time. The soil gives no answer. The clay holds no pottery. The bedrock is silent. Perhaps the question is wrong. Perhaps it wasn't a community that buried its own. Perhaps it was someone else, an outsider, a witness, or a guardian. Someone who came from far away to place these bodies here, far from scrutiny, far from the eyes of others. Could it be that this was not a place of belonging, but of deliberate forgetting? The edges of the depression are softened by erosion. Seasons have passed over it like waves over stone, wearing, reshaping, smoothing the harsh lines into something more natural, more accidental. But it was not always this way. Long ago, it would have been a fresh wound. Fresh earth turned, freshly closed. Someone once stood at the rim and looked down. And maybe they paused. Maybe they listened too. It's tempting to frame this as tragedy, to assign grief or guilt. But what if this place was chosen for its peace? What if it was not abandonment, but protection? Not secrecy, but sanctity? Maybe this distance was meant to preserve something, to keep it from being touched by later hands, by us. Still, the mind returns to the practical. Why here? Why nowhere near water? Why not closer to shelter or shade? The geology offers no clear reason. No caves nearby. No outcrops with sacred carvings. The soil is stubborn, dense, not ideal for digging. And yet it was dug. Someone made the effort. Someone knew this was where they wanted the dead to rest. Could it be that the location itself was once known for something else? A gathering place, a site of ritual, a clearing for stories long since silenced? What if this land remembers something we've never known? Maybe that's what lingers here. Not spirits, not echoes, but the shape of memory itself. The imprint of knowledge once held and now dissolved. A cultural trace, like breath on cold glass, fading before it can be seen clearly. There are no ruins to study, no language to translate, only the land, and the way it dips as if bowing to something unseen. We walk its perimeter not like investigators, but like dreamers circling an unsolved thought. Sometimes, history is not lost to war or fire. Sometimes it is lost simply because no one carried it forward. A generation ends, and the next begins somewhere else. The thread unravels in silence, and we are left to wonder if this place was meant to be remembered or hidden. If those who laid the bones here expected anyone to come after them. If they ever imagined the future, our present, brushing against their past. The earth doesn't forget, but it doesn't speak loudly. It whispers through soil and sediment, through tree roots that twist and coil over time. It preserves just enough to raise the question, never quite enough to answer it. And this pit, this soft interruption in the skin of the world, speaks in that same voice. Quiet, patient, untranslatable, a place that doesn't quite fit and maybe isn't meant to. And if it wasn't meant to be found, what else sleeps beneath our feet, waiting not for discovery, but for silence to be honored? In the pit, there are no ornaments, no tokens of belief, no beads pressed in a palm or neck. No idols clasped between ribs. The bones lie bare, unaccompanied, like thoughts left unfinished. It is not emptiness in the physical sense. There's no sense of looting, no broken shards, no signs of loss. Only absence, vast and deliberate, the kind that feels older than forgetting. Usually, we search for culture in the patterns, in the symbols etched into clay, in the stories carved into stone, in the fragments of fabric wrapped around ancient forms. Culture leaves a residue, a fingerprint. But here, the hands that buried these bodies, if they were buried at all, left no signature, no marks of art, nor tools of trade. Just the simple, stark truth of death. And in that truth, a strange humility. Who were they? Not a name, or tribe, or empire, but in rhythm. What did they sing if they sang at all? What stars did they follow? Did they have gods, or was the sky enough? Did they believe in anything at all beyond the body and the breath? It is possible to die without record, but is it possible to die without story? We walk among the bones not as historians, but as listeners. The kind of listening that happens in stillness, the kind that takes hours or years or generations. But these bones do not speak in language. They do not conform to what we expect. There are no ceremonial poses, no grave goods to hint at rank or love. The teeth are worn, the joints uneven, the skull small, delicate. Children again, more than we anticipated, more than we understand. There's a loneliness in their silence. But perhaps it is not their loneliness. Perhaps it is our own. The ache of being unable to place them in the lineage of the known. The discomfort of not knowing which box to tick, which shelf to place them on. We ask over and over what they were, and the bones only return our question, hollowed and unchanged. Maybe this was a culture that didn't leave things behind, not because they lacked complexity, but because their complexity wasn't expressed in the material. Maybe they lived lightly, light enough to not disturb the land they moved through, light enough that even memory, once it faded, left no shadow behind. Could it be that we were searching for the wrong things? Looking for monuments, when meaning was carried in gesture. Looking for myths, when knowledge was passed in breath, or song, or look. If nothing was written and nothing preserved, does that make it less real or more fragile? We assume that every people must want to be remembered. But what if some chose not to be? Not out of shame, but out of reverence. What if transience was their truth? To live, to vanish, to not anchor themselves to stone or clay or story. Not because they were primitive, but because they knew impermanence as sacred. It is strange to think of a people without artifacts. A people who touched the earth and left no mark. And yet, perhaps that is a kind of wisdom we've lost. Perhaps presence doesn't always mean permanence. Perhaps legacy can be lighter than we've ever considered. They belong to the earth and then return to it, seamlessly. Their bones now hold only the shape of what once was, not who, not how, not why. Just a soft reminder that life passed through here and moved on. There is no way to know how they lived. But there is still time to ask how we choose to hold them now. Do we catalog them? Do we try to fit them into the old timelines, the old charts? Or do we simply let them be, not as a mystery to solve, but as a truth to witness? Not all cultures leave ruins. Some leave rhythms. Some leave pauses. Some leave only questions. And in those questions, we may find a different kind of memory. One that doesn't restore the past, but honors its distance. One that doesn't explain, but accepts. And yet, if a people can pass through the world without leaving a name, what does that say about the names we cling to? There's a kind of forgetting that happens slowly, not in the mind, but in the earth, where rain doesn't scream, doesn't rage, but simply continues. Drop after drop, century after century. It is not a race with fury. It erases with patience. Not because it wants to, but because it must. Because the land is alive, and in being alive, it changes. And in changing, it forgets. The pit rests beneath open sky, uncovered, unguarded, its soil softened and resettled 1,000 times over. There are no walls to hold it, no stones to mark its perimeter. Even its outline has blurred, a once clear edge now fading into the gentle swell of surrounding ground. Once, perhaps, it was a sharp interruption in the land. But now, time has begun to smooth it over, like wind over glass, like hands over old pages. We think of erosion as damage. But what if it is also memory's twin? What if the wind and water are not erasing, but preserving differently, layering, not in stone, but in suggestion? The witnesses, the things that might have told us what happened here, have long since vanished. Wooden beams, if there were any, would have rotted decades ago. Fabric, even the finest weave, would have frayed into the hunger of soil. Bones endure longer, but even they are not immune. Their edges dull, their surfaces wear, the carvings of identity slowly fading into anonymity. We dig, and the sediment speaks, but not in full sentences. Just gestures, just whispers, a patch of discolored earth, a subtle shift in texture, traces of ash that might have been fire, or simply time. The rain has been generous and unrelenting, each season leaving its soft fingerprint on the ground, pressing down, lifting away, a slow dance of layers and loss. And yet, something remains, not in clarity, but in contrast. The very absence of clear evidence becomes its own presence. We expect shards of pottery. We expect beads, or bones in rigid, ritualistic form. Instead, we find only hints, outlines with missing centers. A suggestion that someone was here, but no voice, no echo. Could it be that the rain is not forgetting, but editing, selecting what the future will find, curating what will be allowed to stay? And if so, what does it choose to keep and why? Perhaps the rain remembers what we do not. Perhaps it knows that too much evidence becomes noise. That memory, like soil, needs room to breathe. Perhaps erosion is not a villain, but a storyteller with a different rhythm, one that measures truth in decades, not days. There are channels in the land now, tiny gullies where water gathers and runs. We can trace them with our fingertips as though they were lines in an ancient poem. They carve the surface in slow, invisible hours, and what they carry away is not just dirt, but the fragile scaffolding of context. And maybe those who were buried here understood that. Maybe they chose a place where nature would soften their story, blending it into the breathing skin of the earth. Maybe they believed that anonymity was not loss, but a return, a reunion with silence. What if history is not the recording of facts, but the acceptance of fading? What if we are not meant to know everything, but to witness what remains after forgetting has done its work? The rain falls again, lightly, almost kindly. It taps on the layers of loam and dust and unseen bone. It does not ask permission. It does not apologize. It simply continues as it always has. And beneath it, the ground exhales just a little, as if loosening its grip on something ancient, as if letting go, not to discard, but to transform. And so we sit by the edge of the pit, not in conquest, but in companionship. We know we cannot stop the erosion. We know we cannot recover what has already turned to dust. But we can listen. We can wonder. We can trace the shape of forgetting and call it beautiful, even if it does not give us answers. And still, if memory can wash away without warning, what truths might already be beneath our feet, vanished, unspoken, and waiting to be dreamed again? There are traces of travel that no map can show. Beneath the surface of a bone, under the enamel of teeth, within the slow accumulation of breath turned to chemistry, lie the quiet markers of place, of origin, of change, of long-forgotten belonging. They are not written in ink or etched in stone. They are written in atoms. Strontium, carbon, oxygen, carried invisibly through the bloodstream of the long dead. We do not find directions. We do not find names. We find ratios, minute delicate balances, a whisper of riverbed limestone locked inside a molar, a signature of ancient rainfall preserved in the marrow of a child. These are not sentences, but syllables, fragments of language written by the earth itself. And still, we try to read them. Strontium tells us about the ground, the rocks beneath the surface, weathered into dust, taken up by plants, consumed by bodies, stored in teeth like silent records. A jawbone excavated from the pit may carry the isotope profile of a distant valley, a valley now dry, or swallowed by trees, or paved into silence. The pattern doesn't shout. It doesn't declare origin. It simply leans softly in one direction toward a place that once fed the living. Oxygen tells us about water, the kind sipped in early childhood in a village that might not exist anymore. Its well dried up, its soil blown away. And carbon remembers diet, what was harvested, what was hunted, what the air tasted like when breath last left the lungs. Together, these elements form a trail, not a road, not a line, but a drifting mist of probabilities. They suggest movement. They hint at belonging, but they are incomplete. Faded signs on a path, long overgrown. We think we're listening to science, but sometimes it feels more like listening to ghosts. Could it be that these bones do not just lie still? They sing, not in music, but in molecular harmony. A low hum of lost geography, a lullaby for the soil that once knew their weight. And yet, even these traces can lie, not because the elements deceive us, but because time erodes even the accuracy of nature. Burial changes everything. Water leaches into the ground, rearranging isotope ratios. Soil breathes in and out with the seasons. Even bones themselves begin to shift, to break down, to blend with what surrounds them. So we measure what we can. We compare. We build profiles. And slowly, tentatively, we begin to sketch what may have been. This child was likely born near the coast. The strontium says salt and shell. This one, farther inland, limestone hills and fresh water. And this one, this smallest of them, carries the chemical accent of a land 200 miles away, a place no longer marked on maps. Were they travelers? Were they brought here by others? Were they pilgrims, refugees, captives, messengers? The bones tell us where they came from, but not why they came. Not who they loved, not who waited for them and never saw them return. Maybe they never meant to stay. Maybe this was not their home. Maybe it was never meant to be a home at all, just a stopping point, a sacred place for leaving behind. Is it possible that this pit, this hollow in the earth, was a place of convergence? A final resting place chosen not by blood or border, but by belief? A place people were brought to from many lands, not because they belonged there, but because they belonged nowhere else? It's strange to think that identity can be boiled down to a ratio of isotopes. And stranger still that even these numbers fade. Time, again, is not a keeper of detail. It is a maker of distance. The older the bone, the blurrier the voice. And yet, the blur itself becomes its own kind of truth. A reminder that everything, even chemistry, is vulnerable to forgetting. We don't have names. We don't have languages. But we have strontium, carbon, oxygen. We have the subtle alignments that point us toward distant hills and vanished lakes. We have evidence of origin, if not intention. We have presence, if not story. And we wonder, how many other bones rest beneath our feet, carrying within them the echoes of faraway lands? How many other lives have left behind no culture, no legend, only the soft fingerprint of the soil they once walked? We lean over these bones as listeners, not to dissect, not to demand, but to hear whatever remains. Even if what remains is only suggestion, only the breathless drift of elements that once knew the warmth of life. And still, if even the elements grow quiet over time, what does that mean for the stories still waiting to be uncovered? We look down into the pit, not as a whole, but as a page. The earth writes in layers, not with ink, but with sediment, soft pulses of time, one atop the other. A season of flood, a decade of wind, a generation of stillness, 1,000 years of dust. And beneath it all, something meant to be forgotten or remembered differently. Stratigraphy, they call it, the science of layers, the patience of time becoming visible. Soil tells stories by where it sits, by what it covers, by what it lets slip through. In most sites, the tale is ordered. Neat even. Human time stacked like books in a library of stone. Each horizon a moment. Each shift a chapter. But here, something is broken. Something doesn't fit. The soil around the pit resists reading. It crumbles when handled. It doesn't hold form. There are faint bands of color, hints of iron and clay and ash. But they refuse to align. A fracture runs through the middle. A rupture, not just of soil, but of story. Could it be that the layers were disturbed, not by time, but by hands? Not erosion, but interruption? Maybe this place was opened once before, uncovered, disturbed, sealed again. Maybe it has been hiding not just from us, but from itself. Beneath the topsoil lies a sudden drop in consistency. Darker, looser, almost unnaturally soft. It suggests something dug, something filled, not natural sedimentation, but human movement. And deeper still, the earth hardens again, compacted, unwilling to yield. As if time snapped, then resumed. One story paused, another layered on top. And what sits between those stories are the bones. Stratigraphy becomes poetry when it fails to explain. The absences become metaphors. The silence becomes its own rhythm. We are left not with data, but with intuition. A feeling almost that something was done here in secret. Not once, but twice. What if this pit was not a grave in the usual sense? What if it was a place meant to interrupt memory? To take one story and bury it beneath another? Not to honor it, but to erase it? A burial of the burial. A silence pressed into the soil so deeply it would collapse under the weight of its own forgetting. Still, there are clues. Tiny disruptions in the grain. A shift in the mineral profile, suggesting import, soil brought from somewhere else. Not local, not native. A foreign layer introduced deliberately, perhaps ritually. Why bring soil to a grave already dug, unless the grave was meant to become something more? Somewhere in the middle strata, we find a fine scattering of shell fragments, crushed, embedded. Not modern. Fossilized sea life, likely ground by hand, mixed into the soil like a binding agent or an offering. It's not unheard of. In some ancient practices, shell dust was believed to neutralize spirits, to calm unrest, to seal something permanently shut. Could it be that the dead were not only buried, but contained? The stratigraphy resists clear interpretation. There is no pottery to date, no burned layer to anchor our timelines. No disaster sealed in ash, no flood line to mark the years. Just this silent rupture, this break between layers that will not speak to each other. It reminds us that the earth does not always remember in order, that history is not always laid out like a path, but scattered like stones in a riverbed, some sharp, some smooth, some missing entirely. We trace these layers as best we can, knowing that something happened here. Something careful, something meant to hide or hold or hallow. And as we stare into the soil, it stares back, not with answers, but with its own kind of patience. It does not need to explain. It only needs to endure. Perhaps the question is not what happened here, but what was meant never to be known. And if even the layers of time can be broken, what else, then, might be buried out of sequence? We reach a depth where the soil darkens slightly, thickens with age. The trowel moves more slowly here, more respectfully. Each motion, less excavation, more reverence. What emerges is not a structure, not a single body, but many. Small, fragile, layered as if by seasons rather than ceremony. The silence around them deepens. Not just the stillness of being underground, but the deeper quiet of something inexplicably gentle. They were children, dozens of them, rib cages the size of curled hands, teeth not yet pushed through the gum line, bones so light it seems to resist the idea of permanence. They lie close to one another, but not arranged. There is no order, no clear ritual, no alignment to the sun, no token placed between the fingers, just the weightless hush of a shared resting place. Some are nestled tightly, knees drawn to chest. Others are stretched long, as if sleeping. There are no injuries, no breaks, no wounds that speak of battle, nor trauma, no sign of disease in the enamel, no marks of famine. Just pause, just lives that stopped before they could fully begin. And still, the question sits with us, low in the throat. Why? Could it have been sickness, swift and silent? A fever that left no trace in the bone? Or was it something else, something beyond biology, a choice, a belief, a ritual we no longer recognize. Maybe they were never meant to live long, not because of cruelty, but because of context. A world, perhaps, where infant mortality was common. A world where grief took different forms, not in weeping, but in acceptance. Not in denial, but in surrender. And yet, something here feels different. This is not a scatter, not a careless discard. These children were placed, gently, into the earth. Their bones do not speak of haste. There is care, even if we cannot name it. There is tenderness, even in absence. Maybe they were mourned not in monument, but in silence. Maybe this burial was a lullaby, soft, wordless, shared. They rest together. That much is certain. Whether they knew each other in life, we cannot know. But in death, they have become part of the same question, one too old to answer, too deep to lift without breaking. We find no toys, no carved tokens or charms to accompany them, no signs of what they were meant to become, no symbols of protection, no gods invoked in stone or shell. Just the earth folding inward around them, like a slow and sorrowful breath. In other graves, we often see signs of passage, rites that mark the journey from one world to the next. But here, the transition feels still, as though they did not leave, but simply fell asleep, as though time itself was asked to watch over them, and agreed. Could it be that they were part of something larger? A seasonal event? A communal offering? A story whose language we no longer speak? There are echoes of similar sites across the world, mass burials of children, unexplained, suspended in shared quietude. And each time, we search for reason. Each time, we come away with only more wonder. Maybe childhood itself was once understood differently. Not as a beginning, but as something more sacred, something closer to the divine, to the in-between. Maybe their short lives were not failures, but fulfillments of a role, a belief, a balance. Or maybe they were just children, loved and lost, and carried here in arms that shook with grief. Maybe the silence we hear is not mystery, but mourning. Whatever the truth, it lies beyond the reach of our questions. It rests in the dirt, under layers of seasons and sediment. It hums faintly beneath the bones. A song too old to remember, too soft to repeat. We dust each skull with brushes so fine they barely disturb the air. We take photographs, measurements, samples, but all of it feels like a whisper through a closed door. The real story remains inside, untouched, not because we lack tools, but because it was never meant to be opened. They are together. That much is clear. Whether they were placed together or found each other after, we may never know. But in this earth, they are not alone. And still, if children can vanish without violence, without record, without name, how many other silences have we mistaken for peace? We keep digging, gently, as though time itself were brittle, searching not for bodies now, but for their context, the debris of daily life, the artifacts that usually outlast the hands that held them. A stone flake, a broken bead, a heart scar by long-cooled fire, the familiar footprints of culture, even in its smallest gestures. But here there is nothing, no tools, no pigments, no worked bone or smooth clay, not even the blackened soil that tells of fire once lit, no trace of weaving, nor carving, nor the signature curve of intention pressed into material. Just dirt and bone and the silence that sits between them. It's not that the past refuses to speak. It's that it seems to have spoken in a voice we were never meant to hear. Most burial sites leave echoes. This one leaves questions. Could it be that these people lived without tools? Or simply without tools that endure? Wood rots. Fibers decay. Heat and pressure make ghosts of organic things. Maybe their world was built entirely of perishables, soft, graceful, and destined not to remain. Maybe what we mistake for emptiness is merely the passing of time doing exactly what it was always meant to do. Or maybe it was choice. Maybe this was a culture that valued ephemerality. Not because they were primitive, but because they understood how weightless legacy can be. Maybe they didn't want to mark the earth with things, but with presence. Not because they couldn't build, but because they didn't need to, What if they erase themselves, not as tragedy, but as offering? There is something haunting about a people who leave no trace of fire. Fire is the oldest signal we know, the heartbeat of civilization, the warmth of the group, the promise of return. But in this pit, there is no ash, no charcoal, no scorched stones arranged in forgotten rings. They didn't cook here. They didn't gather here. At least, not in the way we understand. This place wasn't lived in. It was arrived at, briefly, purposefully, then left behind. And maybe that's the point. What if this was not a home, but a threshold? A place outside time, outside daily life, visited only for the act of departure? A sacred nowhere, a ritual nowhere. We search for meaning in material, because material is what survives. But maybe meaning here was breath, a word spoken and never written, a hand gesture made in dusk and never repeated, something too delicate for the fossil record, something never meant to be studied, only lived. And that, too, leaves us unsettled, because we want to place them somewhere. We want to assign them a name, a period, a box in the chronology. But this absence resists placement. They do not match the known. They drift between the categories. Too refined to be wild, too subtle to be ceremonial, too structured to be accident, too soft to be remembered by anything but the land. Could it be that we are wrong to assume loss? What if this isn't erasure, but completeness? What if what we call missing is only the distance between our understanding and their intention? It's tempting to imagine them on the edges of a known world. A people who lived lightly and chose to vanish, not in despair, but in grace. Not because they failed to survive, but because they succeeded in disappearing. A people without fire, without tools, without inscription, but not without meaning. Their bones lie here still, in a pit with no signature. Their silence intact, their absence deliberate. And we are left, once more, to wonder. And if a people can leave no trace and still be remembered, how many others have passed through history like wind through trees, leaving nothing but movement behind? The ground beneath us is not still. It gives that illusion of permanence, of rest, of finality, but below the surface, the earth is always folding, always shifting, always carrying the past further from the light. Geology is not cruel. It is not merciful either. It simply moves, not in haste, but in rhythm, pressing, tilting, bending time into forms we barely understand. What begins as soft earth becomes stone. What lies flat becomes lifted, angled, cracked. And what once was surface, seen, touched, lived upon, is slowly pressed down into silence. Here in this forgotten pit, the soil holds layers not just of dirt, but of weight. Not just mass, but memory. Weight that has compacted over generations, sealing stories between grains of sediment and shards of mineral thought. Not because they were meant to be forgotten, but because forgetting is the way of the world. Tectonic plates move like breath in slow motion. Continental exhalations that fracture and swallow the land itself. Whole civilizations have disappeared beneath this quiet violence. Temples swallowed by uplift. Rivers redirected by invisible pressure. A city can become a hill. A dwelling can become a stone. And here, too, perhaps something like that has happened. Perhaps this place was not always so quiet. Perhaps it rose and sank in some forgotten upheaval, tilting the ground just slightly enough to slip it out of alignment with the present. Could it be that this pit, this gentle bowl of soil and silence, was once a part of something larger? A low valley that nestled a community? A glade where people gathered in cyclical rhythms, their voices rising like dust in the afternoon heat? Could the landscape we now see be only the echo of what the earth has buried beneath its own breath? We often imagine memory as something preserved, something kept safe in stone or in mind. But geology reminds us that preservation is rare, that most things are not saved, they are altered. What we remember through the land is not a perfect story, but a distortion, a folding of time so complete that beginnings and endings swap places. Fossils are found in stone once submerged in oceans, seashells on mountaintops, forests sealed beneath deserts. Memory doesn't vanish, it migrates. And perhaps this site, too, has shifted more than we know. Maybe the bones we find here were once beneath something else. A shrine, a floor, a canopy of wood and prayer. And when that covering vanished, through decay, through quake, through the slow shrug of terrain, the memory followed. Not because anyone meant to erase, but because stone does not care what we wish to hold on to. There's a philosophy to this forgetting, a kind of quiet instruction, that not all memory must be carried, that some stories are meant to sink, to become one with the layers, perhaps even ours. And yet, as we kneel at the edge of this disrupted landscape, sifting through silt and silence, we feel the weight of what is missing. Not just artifacts, not just names, but arrangement, order, context, the gravity of lost placement. Somewhere, deep beneath our feet, there are layers we will never reach, because they are folded in on themselves, sealed by time, not from malice, but from motion. And inside them, perhaps, are other bones, other tools, other dreams, fossilized not in amber or ash, but in misremembering. Maybe what we find here is not a burial site at all, but a fragment, a sliver broken off from a once whole place, reshaped by the earth into something solitary, something illegible. We cannot ask the land to hold itself still. We cannot ask it to pause for memory's sake. It will keep folding, keep pressing, keep forming futures out of forgotten things. And so we must learn to read not the story itself, but the shape of its absence. To read a broken layer as a question, a fracture as a sentence without an ending. And still, if the earth can fold over memory without even knowing it, how many of our own stories might be pressed into silence before they are ever told? We lift a fragment of bone, featherlight, from its resting place. It crumbles faintly at the edge, like paper long forgotten in a drawer. Sent to the lab, it speaks in a language more precise than memory. The slow mathematics of isotopes, of decay, of elemental clocks ticking quietly in the dark. Carbon, nitrogen, strontium, dates are returned, clean and numerical. But when read against the timeline, they do not whisper. They scream. The bones are older than they should be. Not by a little, by centuries. Long before the first known settlement was founded in this valley. Before any record of habitation. Before the earliest pottery. Before the first fires were thought to have been kindled in this region's soil. The readings do not align with any local culture, any known migration, any historic arrival. The bones do not belong here, and yet they are here. The mind resists. We are trained to fit findings in a framework, like stars into constellations. But some stars drift, and these bones break the sky. What happens when the body refuses to match the history around it? When the data is clear, but the meaning is unclear? Do we change the history or doubt the body? Could it be contamination? Perhaps something interfered with the test. Groundwater seepage, mineral intrusion, cross-layer exposure. We run it again and again, but the numbers hold. They do not shift. The body is older. Not impossibly so, just enough to be disruptive. Out of time, out of context. A memory placed in the wrong chapter. Could this have been a traveler? Someone from far away, brought here and buried in a place they never called home? But if so, where did they come from? And who carried them? Across what land? Through what silence? Toward what purpose? We trace known migration routes, but none pass here this early. We examine pollen caught in the sediment around the bones, but it tells us nothing new. The same grasses, the same undisturbed quiet. The land itself does not seem to notice anything unusual. And that may be the most unsettling part of all, that the earth accepted them, even when our stories will not. We begin to wonder, is it possible the settlement we know came after something else? A deeper layer, a vanished people, a hidden habitation erased so thoroughly that only this single body remains? A civilization, perhaps, so light upon the land that it disappeared without echo, its cities lost not to fire, but to silence? Or perhaps this isn't a discrepancy in history. Perhaps it is a discrepancy in perception. We rely on chronology, like scaffolding. But what if history does not unfold in lines, but in loops? In pockets? In fractures that rearrange what was supposed to come first? Maybe these bones are not a mistake, but a reminder that time, too, is porous. We look again at the soil. There is no sign of intrusion, no hole cut from above. This body was not added later. It has always been here, waiting, unbothered by the stories told above its head. There's a term in archaeology, out-of-place artifacts, finds that do not belong where they are found, often dismissed, often debated, and yet they return again and again. The deeper we dig, the more the past misbehaves. What if history is less a story and more a field of scattered pages? Some burned, some buried, some never written at all. We gather what we can, but some parts do not fit. And maybe they aren't meant to. Maybe these bones that shouldn't be here are here because they're supposed to remind us. Not all knowledge is chronological. Not all presence is linear. Sometimes the past leans in from a different angle, asking only to be witnessed, not explained. We press our palms to the soil and feel its temperature. Cool. Indifferent. It does not argue with the findings. It does not need the story to make sense. And if the past can arrive early, silently, quietly, what other arrivals have we overlooked simply because they did not follow our map? We try once more to measure time, not with calendars or dynasties, not with the brittle names of kings, but with something quieter, something buried inside the breath of long-dead lives. Radiocarbon, the slow exhale of existence, an invisible ticking that begins the moment life ends and continues downward decade by decade until all that's left is half of what once was, and then half again, and then less than a whisper. Carbon's clock is not loud. It does not chime or strike. It fades. Each test is a request, a gentle asking of the universe. When did this life begin to end? We burn a fragment of bone, a rib no longer attached to memory. A piece of charcoal perhaps once used in a fire, now long turned to loam. And in its smoke, we count what remains. Not because the smoke tells us, but because its silence does. The fewer atoms left, the further the drift from now. A subtraction that tells a story in its vanishing. But here, even this story fails to settle. The dates we receive are clear, too old, too calm in their confidence, as if they had never heard of contradiction. They place the bodies outside the known window, again, just beyond the reach of nearby settlements. Not so far as to feel mythic, just far enough to remain inconvenient. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Not that they're ancient, but that they're slightly ancient. Half a step ahead of what came after. A breath before record, like a thought that vanishes the moment before it becomes language. We test again. Other fragments, other samples. Antlers, soot, a sliver of burned bark nestled in the same sediment as the children. Again, the dates settle in the same range. Not mythic, not modern. Just before, just enough to disturb. Just enough to suggest that we are not at the beginning of the story, but somewhere in its middle, missing the first few lines. Could it be contamination? Maybe. Could it be mislabeling, a lab error, a mistake in preparation? Possibly. But repetition brings consistency. And consistency begins to feel like pattern. And patterns, in the absence of clarity, begin to feel like truth. Carbon doesn't lie. It doesn't speculate. It simply ticks. And yet, even in its honesty, it tells us only one thing: how long it's been since something stopped living. It does not tell us how it lived, or why it ended, or who stood beside it when the breath left. It is a timekeeper without memory, a clock without a chime. And in the face of this quiet precision, we are left to wonder, what happened in that gap? Between the numbers and the narrative? Between what Carbon says and what culture cannot confirm? What if there were people before the people we remember? What if they built nothing, wrote nothing, planted no markers in stone or story? What if their only imprint was the slow weathering of their bodies back into soil? We call that prehistory, but what if it's not pre-anything? What if it's simply a history that never learned how to speak in ways we can still hear? Maybe the past is not a road behind us, but a forest. Thick, layered, full of paths we'll never find again. And carbon, for all its grace, is only a compass. It points. It does not tell us which way to walk. And in this case, it points toward a void, a time just before names, a time just before our own certainty begins. The bones are older than the village, the ashes older than the hearths, the silence deeper than the map allows. And yet here they are, still, waiting. And if carbon, in all its precision, only leads us to more questions, what else have we trusted that was never meant to explain? The fossil record reads like an interrupted dream. Long stretches of clarity, followed by erasure. Patterns made of fragments, stitched together across millennia of absence. And in those gaps, in the long pauses between fossils and fires, bones and belief, we build narratives, not because they are true, but because we cannot bear the silence. Every decade, something shifts. A tooth in the wrong cave. A carving in an unexpected sediment. A tool where there should be none. We learn, unlearn, and relearn what we thought we understood. Human origins redrawn. Civilizations relocated. Extinctions questioned. The past, as we know it, keeps rearranging itself beneath our feet, as if history were not a timeline, but a tide. The pit is no exception. It does not confirm. It interrupts. Its very presence feels like an error, a contradiction too still to ignore. We want it to be a clue, a bridge between epochs, a lost link in the chain of ancestry or migration. But what if it's something else entirely? What if it's not a bridge, but a break? We try to place it, try to root it into what came before or what came after. But there is no cultural fingerprint, no linguistic sieve, no technological continuity. The bones here echo no known story. And the deeper we look, the less they resemble anything familiar. Could it be a false start? Evolution is rarely a straight line. Life begins and begins again. Whole lineages emerge, flourish, vanish, leaving barely a ripple in the geological memory. Some branches lead to us. Others end quietly, buried beneath centuries of dust and no ceremony. Maybe the pit belongs to one of those branches. A short-lived path, a trial, a forgotten experiment in being human, or almost human, that never became a story because there was no one left to tell it. What if these weren't ancestors but parallels? We like to think we are the conclusion, that everything before us led, inevitably, to now. But the fossil record says otherwise. It is a book with torn pages and smudged ink, full of crossed-out chapters. Some of those chapters may have looked like us, moved like us, thought, perhaps, in ways not unlike our own. And then they stopped, not because they failed, but because the world moved on. The earth is a harsh editor. It does not hesitate to delete. Ice comes, rivers shift, volcanoes rewrite the sky. A single drought can silence a people. A single virus can end a language. And when that happens, there is no appeal, no second draft. Only the layers of sediment gently covering what remains. This pit may be one such deletion. Not a clue, but a silence. Not a signpost, but a stutter in the grand rhythm of life. A place where one story ended softly and no one noticed. And still we dig, not just through earth, but through meaning, hoping to find a reason, a pattern, a purpose behind the pause. But the fossil record has never promised consistency. For every elegant sequence of skulls and stones, there is a skeleton out of place, a burial too deep, or too advanced, or too early. These are not mistakes. They are reminders that time does not obey us. That memory, like sediment, settles unevenly. Could it be that the pit is not an origin, but a remnant of something else entirely? A people who branched off and left no mark? A culture that unfolded parallel to the timeline we trace, brushing against it only briefly before slipping away? Maybe that's what makes it so hard to place. We want it to fit. We want it to connect. But maybe it doesn't. Maybe its truth lies not in continuity, but in isolation. And in that isolation, we glimpse something uncomfortable. That the record we trust most, the fossil record, is not a full story, but a series of questions preserved in bone. And if the past can leave behind so many beginnings that never reached us, how many futures might we lose before they begin? We keep searching, not for what is there, but for what isn't. Absence has begun to speak louder than presence. Each layer holds emptiness with such quiet insistence. It feels intentional. There are no pathogens in the bone, no lesions, no indicators of starvation. The enamel is healthy. The marrow rings, when tested, show no signs of long-term trauma. Death came, but not violently, not hungrily, not in fear, no mass migration either. The isotopes stay still. There's no hint of distance in the teeth, no signs of a body once in motion. Whoever they were, they stayed, rooted, motionless, even in disappearance. Not because they were confined, but because they did not leave. Not because they were forgotten, but because no one came to remember them. We expect history to explain itself through marks, through the residue of living. But here, there is only smoothness. Only the gentle echo of things that never happened. No tools, no hearth, no defense wounds, no videolights. And yet, they are undeniably here. They persist, not in what they gave us, but in what they refuse to leave. Could it be that the absence is the culture? That this silence was not a collapse, but a decision? A people who turn away from permanence, who did not want to be preserved, who didn't believe in legacy as we do, in monuments, in records, in stone. Maybe they believed in breath, in disappearance, in letting the earth keep the story for itself. It's easy to see absence as failure, to mistake missing pieces for carelessness or loss. But maybe absence is its own design, not because they couldn't leave a mark, but because they knew better than to try. We hold a femur in our hands, clean, smooth, unbroken. No sign of suffering, no sign of struggle. It could have belonged to a child who simply lay down and never rose again. The idea hurts, but gently, like a whisper of grief, not a scream. We want to know what happened, but the bone says only, I was. And now I'm not. Is it possible for a civilization to vanish without dying? We search for fire. There is none. For enclosure, for defense, for structure, for conflict. We find none of these. The soil yields no char. The layers hold no signs of siege or disaster. And so we are left with the unsettling possibility that nothing went wrong. No climax, no downfall, just a slow exhalation. What if they let go? And yet, that letting go leaves behind its own kind of weight. Not because we understand it, but because we don't. The missing pieces press against us more heavily than relics ever could. It feels strangely like standing before a locked door, not broken, not hidden, but simply unopened. Absence has become a shape we walk through. There's something beautiful in that, something reverent. Not all stories end with final acts. Some just soften until they fade. And perhaps this is one of them. And if silence can linger so long, so clearly, across soil and season, what else might we one day hear, simply by listening harder? We press our fingers into the earth and lift it gently, grain by grain, not to disturb, but to listen. Soil is not just matter. It is memory made soft, a layered recording of everything that touched it, every root, every raindrop, every breath that returned to the ground as dust. The earth forgets nothing, but it speaks in a language so quiet, so reluctant, that only the most patient questions can reach it. Here, the soil is light and powdery near the surface, then darkens as it descends, a slow deepening of tone, like dusk turning toward night. We test the pH. It tells us how long the body has been here. We test for nitrogen, phosphorus, traces of calcium. They tell us the story of decomposition, of absorption, but nothing more. There are no pigments leached from cloth, no residue from burial dyes, no metals from jewelry or tools. Just nutrients evenly spread, no staining from blood, no burst of organic trauma, as if the bodies gave themselves gently, atom by atom, to the soil, and the soil accepted them without question. Could it be that this earth has absorbed them completely? Not just their bones, but their essence? That the whispers of who they were now sleep in the chemistry of loam? Not visible, not audible, but somehow still there? We measure magnetic fields. Look for soil compaction, microscopic imprints of ancient feet. Nothing remains. Nothing shifts. No signature of settlement. No bottom layer. No asphalt. No burn line. Just soft, undisturbed strata, like pages never written on. Maybe they did live here. Maybe they danced where we now stand, and their movements were too light to mark. Maybe the soil was never theirs, but became theirs only in death. Still we dig. Still we strain to hear. We send samples for analysis. Look for starch granules from food, pollen trapped in clay, fungal spores, any evidence of life once lived. But the pit gives us no such offering. It remains as it was, indifferent and patient. A womb of silence. And that silence is starting to feel intentional. What if they were careful? Not careless, but deliberate in their disappearance. What if this soil was chosen, not for fertility or closeness, but for its unwillingness to record? A place too neutral to betray a secret? Could it be that some cultures buried their dead, not to remember them, but to erase them from the reach of time? Not because they were ashamed, but because they believed in stillness more than story? Soil usually tells us everything, but this soil refuses. It offers only gradients. No eggies, no signatures. It gives us presence without proof, an echo without source. Maybe that's the answer. Maybe the echo is the evidence. Not what it tells us, but the fact that it's there at all. A murmur in the chemical silence. A breath too faint to interpret. The trace of a people who did not want to be known, but who are, somehow, still here. We sift. We listen. We read absence like a text rubbed nearly blank. The voice of the pit is not loud, but it is steady. Not because it wants to be heard, but because it never left. And yet, if even the soil has been taught to forget, what hope is there for memory above the ground? The pit was known. Not marked, not mapped, but known. It appeared on aerial surveys as an anomaly, a shallow depression, unnaturally round. Locals spoke of it only vaguely. A place birds didn't nest. A patch of earth where snow melted slower. Farmers avoided it, not out of fear, but out of a kind of inherited indifference. It had always been there, and so no one asked what it was. Decades passed. Equipment improved. New surveys were made. Still, no one came. Other sites were chosen. Sites with stones, with carvings, with the promise of something to see. But this place, soft, still, and absent of ornament, made no sound. And so it was left alone, like a sentence no one wanted to finish. Why? Why do we answer some calls and not others? Why do some ruins demand excavation, while others sleep undisturbed? Perhaps we're drawn to drama, to scale, to stories that fit into the myths we already know. Maybe we're afraid of places that whisper instead of shout. Places that offer no hero, no king, no temple to glorify. Only death and silence. It's possible the pit survived by being unremarkable. No legend attached to it. No rumor of treasure. Just soil. Just shadow. And maybe that was its protection. Not because it was sacred, but because it was ignored. There's a strange safety in being overlooked. History often preserves what it admires. But just as often, it preserves what it fears, what it conquers, what it can turn into a story, what it can name. This pit, however, asked for none of that. It gave no invitation, and so no one came. Could it be that forgetting is a form of mercy? That by not being remembered, something avoids being distorted, broken, consumed? Not because it is unworthy, but because it is whole in its invisibility? We like to think of memory as preservation, but sometimes memory is invasion. The moment we name a place, we change it. The moment we open it, it begins to disappear. Maybe the pit was waiting for someone who would approach it differently. Not to extract, but to listen. Not to own, but to wonder. Or maybe it wasn't waiting at all. Maybe it never needed to be found. We walk its edges now with careful steps, aware of the eyes that never turn this way. Aware of how long it held its breath beneath the seasons, beneath the boots and hooves and wheels of time. It's easy to forget that not every silence is an accident. Some are chosen. Some are protective. Some are the last defense against the erosion of meaning. And yet, if this place had remained untouched, undisturbed for so long? What'll still lies hidden, simply because no one came looking? The bone holds secrets the soil cannot tell. Inside the curled chambers of ancient marrow, within the brittle threads of time-worn tissue, there are codes, not written in script or carved in stone, but wound tightly in a spiral of inheritance, DNA. A language older than history, older than cities, older than belief. We sample it gently. Not all bones yield. Time is not always kind to the genome, but some preserve it like a whisper beneath the weight of centuries. Just enough to listen for a name. Not a name in words, but in patterns. Markers of ancestry. Traces of belonging. We feed it into machines built to detect echoes. Machines that compare and match and sort and place. And we wait. Because genetics, we're told, is where history gets confirmed. Where questions find their anchors. Where migration becomes map. Where the dead meet the living again in the long corridors of shared sequence. But this time, the corridors are empty. There is no match. Not to nearby populations. Not to ancient ones. Not to the wandering clusters of kin who moved across this landscape in ages past. No alignment. No overlap. Just difference. Just dissonance. The results come back again, checked, verified, repeated. The story is the same. These bodies do not belong to anyone we know. Could be contamination, an error in sequencing. We consider it. Rule it out. The data is clean. The silence is real. It is a strange thing to find a person who has no descendants. Stranger still to find a group. Dozens. An entire pocket of humanity, once alive, now untethered from every line we thought we were tracing. They left no mark in the genome of the present. Are they gone? Truly gone? Or do they simply dissolve? Maybe their genes live on, faintly diluted, hidden beneath generations of change. Maybe they were absorbed, erased by the sheer weight of population and time. Not erased violently, but gradually, the way a drop of ink disappears into a river. Or maybe they became something else. Maybe they changed in ways we don't yet know how to read. Maybe our databases are too narrow, our categories too certain. Maybe we're only seeing what we've been taught to expect, and these people were never meant to fit. What if they carried knowledge in their blood that wasn't meant to last? What if they chose to step sideways out of the future, not by vanishing, but by blending so deeply into the world that not even DNA remembers them? We stare at the sequences. They should give us certainty, but instead, they give us the outline of something missing. A presence defined by lack, a shape formed by what's no longer there. Genetic ghosts. They're not ancestors, not survivors, not strangers, just other. There are stories from every culture about people who came before the known ones. Not quite human, not quite spirit. The ones who walked the land when it was still learning its name. Often forgotten or hidden beneath layers of myth, but sometimes remembered as watchers, as wanderers, as the first to bury, the first to disappear. Could this be them? Is it possible we've found not the missing link, but the forgotten fork? A side path that never returned. A human moment that bloomed in silence and faded before it could pass itself forward? And if so, what does that mean for the stories we tell about ourselves? We build our identities from inheritance. But what of those who inherited nothing and left nothing behind but bone? Still, something lingers. Not in data, not in name, but in the quiet. The way the pit holds them. The way the earth didn't let them drift too far. Maybe being forgotten doesn't mean being lost. And yet, if even DNA forgets, who else might we be walking past without ever knowing? We define civilization by its shadows, the columns left standing, the walls that held, the ruins that refused to fall. But what are the civilizations that never built to last? The ones who lived not for permanence, but for presence? The ones who passed through time like wind through reeds, seen only by the motion they left behind? It's easy to believe that greatness must leave evidence. That culture must inscribe itself on a stone, carve itself into mountain, echo itself across centuries. But perhaps there is another kind of greatness, the kind that chooses not to remain. What if a people lived gently, not because they were lesser, but because they believed the earth was not theirs to mark. No temples, no roads, no records, just rhythm, just breath, just the quiet rituals of being alive, repeated in silence, surrendered with humility. We look to the pit now, not as a grave, but as a question, not as the end of something, but as its only visible edge. A civilization might have stood here, unseen, not high above the ground, but low to it. Homes made of reeds, washed away with the rain. Paths walked barefoot, pressed too lightly to be remembered. Their voices spoken into wind, not carved into walls. And yet, something held them together, long enough for dozens to gather, to belong, to bury. Could a civilization exist without legacy? Could it be real without architecture, without lineage, without a single artifact to tell its story? Maybe we've mistaken visibility for truth. Maybe some worlds never wanted to be remembered, not because they were unimportant, but because they knew memory could distort what it tried to hold. They lived in the now, not the after, in cycles, not timelines, in breath, not inscription. We often say they vanished, but perhaps they didn't vanish. Perhaps they completed their circle. Perhaps disappearance was their design. The pit could be all that's left, not by accident, but by intention. A final gesture of presence, left behind like a footprint before the tide. Not because they were erased, but because they left. And what would that mean for us? If a people could build a world with no cities, no symbols, and still call a whole, could we recognize a civilization by how little it took, rather than how much it left? Archaeology isn't designed for this. It searches for patterns, for repetition, for signatures in fire and stone. But here, there are none, just the bones, and the breath of what might have once been. We try to name them, but maybe they had no name. Or maybe their name was not meant to be carried forward. Maybe it was spoken only between them and the trees, them and the stars, them and the soil that now holds their memory like mist. It's difficult to study what wasn't left behind, but maybe this pit, this single gesture in the dirt, is not a fragment but a whole, a complete sentence, the only thing they meant to be found. And if a people can live a life, a full and rich and sacred life, without leaving a trace, what else might we be missing, just because we've taught ourselves to only see what stays? Overhead, the sky has not changed. The stars shift gently, season to season, but the same patterns circle above, as they always have, as they always will. Even as continents drift and cities sink and languages dissolve, the heavens keep their rhythm. No empire can slow the moon. No dynasty alter sorion. It's strange to think that above the pit, this hollow place where lives were laid to rest in silence, the stars kept watching. That night after night, the same constellations that guide us now once looked down on these children. Before the burial, before the forgetting, before the world turned its gaze away, the sky was the same. And yet, no one remembers. We wonder if they saw the stars, if they followed the same arcs across the horizon, the sweep of the Pleiades, the long shoulder of Cassiopeia, the winter blade of Sirius. We wonder if they gave names to those lights, names that breathed through generations, whispered beside fires, painted onto skins, or traced in the air with fingers too small to reach them. But no records remain. The earth holds no sky maps, no celestial calendars, no carved guides to the firmament. And so we ask, do constellations remember what the earth forgets? Is it possible that above every lost people, the stars still echo their story? Maybe the shapes we see are palimpsests, overlaid myths rewritten again and again. One culture replaces another. One legend swallows the last. What we call a hunter, they may have called a river. What we trace as a crown, they may have seen as a wound. And all the while, the stars themselves remain unchanged. Not because they agree, but because they do not need our stories to exist. Still, we project. We always have. The earliest humans painted stars onto cave ceilings. Rough ochre specks arranged in arcs we can still recognize. They charted eclipses with bones, tracked solstices with shadows. The sky was memory's first canvas. It required no paper, no stone, only attention. So perhaps the children in the pit looked upward, not in fear, not in question, but in recognition. Maybe they saw not gods, but ancestors, not warnings, but return. The stars were not distant. They were present. And maybe, just maybe, they were kind. Tonight, if you were to lie beside the pit, beneath the very same sky, nothing above would seem unusual. The planets still glide in their invisible clockwork. The same cold blue of early night still softens into velvet. The constellations still emerge one by one, as they did for millennia, as they did for the ones buried below. And yet, it's the stillness of that continuity that cuts deepest. Because even as the earth forgets, erodes, buries, reshapes, overwrites, the sky holds steady. A kind of quiet defiance. A memory that does not depend on language, or tombs, or time. Could the sky be the only witness? We imagine history as downward, as sediment, as ruins, as layers in the earth. But maybe it's upward too. Maybe memory rises. Maybe it burns with hydrogen and dances across the heavens in perfect silence, needing no archive to endure. And so we find ourselves beneath this eternal ceiling, unsure how much of what we've lost might still be reflected above. And yet, if the sky remembers this much, what else might be written there that we've forgotten to read? Perhaps not everything is lost. Perhaps it only drifts, from order into scatter, from shape into ash, from clarity into fog. Entropy does not destroy. It unthreads, slowly, patiently, without cruelty, like a tide that never rises high, but never stops pulling. All things tend toward disorder. Even memory. A carved symbol once held meaning. A spiral etched into stone. A ring of fire pits across a valley. A row of bones aligned too neatly to be chance. But over time, the spiral blurs, the pits collapse, the bones shift. The wind does not care for alignment. The rain does not keep score. And so we misread, or forget, or never find a pattern at all. Entropy does not announce itself. It does not rip or tear or shout. It wears down, quiet as breath. It dusts over. It breaks bonds, not with force, but with time. A language once spoken, now lost, leaves only whispers. We find fragments on clay and guess their meanings. We guess wrong, not because we are careless, but because the script no longer speaks. The syntax has collapsed. Its context gone. Entropy does not erase history, but it can make it unknowable. Maybe that's the cruelest part. Not that something was destroyed, but that it is still here, just beyond reach. A word almost deciphered. A ritual almost reconstructed. A culture almost recognized, but not quite. We sift through layers of sediment as if they were sentences, as if each stratum tells a story in sequence. But time is not tidy. The layers are smudged. The ink has run. The pit offers bones. But the bodies are too clean, too silent, too disconnected from the rest of the world. What if it wasn't violence that wiped away the records, but entropy? Not because they were forgotten, but because the structures that held them together slowly fell apart. The fabric rotted. The pigments faded. The wood collapsed into soil. The stories, once carried by voice, by craft, by gesture, dissolved into atmosphere. Gone out with a bang, but with a whisper repeated one time too few. Could it be that they tried to remember themselves? Could it be that they buried what mattered most, thinking it would be found, hoping that time would cradle their truths instead of washing them away? Maybe, maybe not. Entropy is not evil. It is nature's equilibrium, the slow drift toward evenness, a balancing of energy. It touches galaxies and graves alike. And in doing so, it levels us all, king and child, monument and whisper, script and silence. And yet, it is also a kind of storyteller, because even in what we can't know, there is still something to feel, something that stirs when we hold a smooth shard of pottery, something that trembles when we see a symbol we cannot read but feel was once sacred. Entropy obscures, but it also creates mystery. And mystery, in its way, keeps history alive, not because we know, but because we continue to ask. Entropy is not the absence of meaning. It is what remains after meaning has shed its skin, after symbols have gone soft at the edges, after time has run its fingers through memory and left it tangled. We are left with impressions, echoes, a warmth in the soil where something once burned, a mineral stain where pigment once lived, a hollow in the earth, shallow now, but once deliberate. And still we lean in, still we wonder, could it be that the ones we search for never meant to be found? Or do they whisper into the future in ways we've forgotten how to hear? Entropy may be the historian we never meant to appoint, writing our legacies in slow decay, binding our truths with dust, hiding our stories behind the fog of chance. And still, here we are, reading the fog as if it were a book. Because what else can we do but wonder? And yet, if entropy can unravel meaning this easily, how many stories have we already misread? Across the spine of time, buried under forest canopies, scorched by desert winds, folded into valleys and riverbeds and icy tundra, there is a pattern, a quiet pattern, one that returns again and again, like breath, shallow, barely spoken, always the same shape. The shape of loss not carried individually, but together. The archetype of the mass grave. This pit here is not alone. It is one of thousands. A shadow in the soil, a pause in the layers, a place where time lingers longer than expected. A break in the rhythm of sediment, where the human body, dozens, sometimes hundreds, gathers in silence, nameless, almost ceremonial in its stillness. And yet, often there is no ceremony, no offerings, no fire, no warning. What does it mean, this echo that repeats across continents? In England, the pit at Charterhouse on Mendip. In Turkey, Catalhoyuk. In Rwanda. In Pompeii. In Cambodia. In the sand-sunk cities of the Sahara. In frozen fields beneath Ukraine. In collapsed courtyards in the Mayan lowlands. Across centuries. Across oceans. Across language. The motif persists, not because we remember, but because we forget in the same way. Always more bodies than names. Always more questions than answers. And here, again, the pit holds them. Not lined up, not shrouded, not adorned. Just bodies folded inward. As if sleep found them suddenly and asked nothing in return. Is it famine? Disease? Fear? Ritual? Maybe. Maybe not. Mass graves speak in riddles. Because they are born not of memory, but of emergency. They come from moments when the world breaks faster than it can be mourned. When time accelerates, and grief is too heavy to carry one soul at a time. But there is a pattern, in the bone positions, in the absence of possessions, in the compressed stratigraphy. Even in the haste, there's still a rhythm. A ritual, perhaps, born of desperation rather than tradition. As if those left behind tried, faintly, to honor what could no longer be understood. Could it be that they were loved? Buried by trembling hands, rushing against the rise of rot, the closing light? Or could it be that no one was left to bury them at all, and the ground took them gently, indifferent but soft? Not because they were hated, but because everyone else was already gone. There's something unsettling in how familiar this shape is. The grave we find in one epoch mirrors the one we find in another. And the faces, when we can reconstruct them, look like us. The jawlines, the foreheads, the curvature of the brow. These were not aliens of history. These were children, elders, kin. Maybe not ours, but not strangers either. We like to think of history as linear, as ascending. But these mass graves remind us of collapse, of cycles, of the strange rhythm of ruin. And how forgetting doesn't always happen slowly. Sometimes it comes all at once. Not because memory faded, but because memory died with the last witness. In these pits, patterns emerge. Recurrences not in what is left, but in what is not. No inscriptions, no boundary stones, no markers to say, here lies. And yet, we always seem to recognize the weight of such ground. Excavators pause. Voices lower. Even when nothing is known, something is felt. Could it be that the land remembers what we cannot? Could it be that grief leaves an imprint deeper than stone? Mass graves do not seek recognition, but they radiate a kind of truth, a quiet, universal ache that transcends culture. When we uncover them, we do not celebrate. We listen, because something broke here. Something was silenced. And even if we never learn the names, we still kneel beside the earth as if it might whisper them back. It rarely does. Still, we catalog. We photograph. We carbon date. We analyze isotopes. We reconstruct DNA. We dig not just into the earth, but into the wound it holds. And this pit, this silent, undecorated hollow, tells us what so many others have, that the end of a people is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet, just absence, just soil. Perhaps that is why the archetype repeats, because silence is universal. Because when history fails, entropy steps in. And what entropy forgets, the earth compacts, seals, preserves, until one day, someone returns with a trowel and starts to ask, "Who are you? Why are you here? Why so many so fast?" And most haunting of all, why does your story feel so familiar? And yet, if we see this same shape again and again, how many more might we never find? The earth folds around them as if in prayer. Not chaos, not violence, just a stillness that feels intentional. And so we begin to wonder, not with urgency, but with a quiet kind of reverence, whether this burial, this pit, this pause in the strata of time was meant. Not because of what is present, but because of what is absent. There are no wounds, no weapons, no signs of haste. The bodies do not sprawl, they rest, shoulder to shoulder, curled, stacked with care, or maybe by custom. It is hard to tell. The soil has pressed down for so long that even tenderness has compacted. But the shape of the arrangement lingers, faint but deliberate, as if some hand, long vanished, placed them this way not in panic, but in faith. Could it be ritual? Could it be grief sculpted into ceremony? Maybe, maybe not. What we call mass graves are sometimes only that because we do not understand the language of their arrangement. Maybe this wasn't abandonment. Maybe it was sacred. Maybe this pit, with its quiet, its repetition, its deliberate density, was a rite. A final gesture offered to the gods, or to time itself. There are traditions we've forgotten, rites never recorded, beliefs buried deeper than stone, deeper than language, fires once lit in reverence, chants once hummed under stars, bones once painted, bathed, positioned in circles or spirals or lines. None of it written, all of it felt. Now, we look down at these remains and name them with words that are not theirs. Burial site, ossuary, pit, catastrophe. And maybe we are wrong, not because we lie, but because memory does. The archaeologist's trowel is gentle, but does not speak the tongue of ghosts. It sifts through sediment like a question, waiting for some reply in pigment or pollen or pressure. And sometimes, just sometimes, it finds a trace. Ochre powder clinging faintly to the base of skull. A layer of char, too uniform to be natural. A stone too smooth, too centered. A suggestion of meaning, untranslatable. And yet, the mind leans forward, because something here feels arranged. Not accidental, not random. In some cultures, entire generations were placed together in earth, not to be forgotten, but to remain whole. Ancestor fields, spirit trenches, sacred pits. And the rites performed before burial were never meant to last. Not an artifact, but an echo. And perhaps this is what we find now. Not the ritual itself, but its afterglow. The bones remember the gesture, even if the gesture no longer has a name. What happens to faith when the story is lost? Does the ritual die? Or does it change? Does the earth carry its own liturgy, quietly absorbing the beliefs of those who walked before? We sometimes imagine religion as eternal, but it too erodes. It shifts. It adapts or disappears. And in places like this, where there is no text, no icon, no monument, we must ask, was this faith or forgetting? Was the burial prayer? A plea? A prophecy? Was it fear of the dead or reverence? Some ancient rites instructed bodies to face east, to rise with the sun. Others buried children in courtyards, to keep them near. Some burned their dead to release the spirit. Others laid them in fetal position, returning them to the earth as they came from the womb. No two cultures grieve the same, and not all grief seeks permanence. What we expect, symbols, patterns, markers, may be a bias of illiterate. But there were ways of believing that left no trace. Faith that lived only in movement, in breath, in song, in firelight against skin, in the hush that follows a death when the world feels thinner, in the act of placing a body beside another, without speaking because the meaning is shared. And if that meaning vanishes, what are we left with? Just bones, just dust, just a circle of archaeologists squinting into time. Still, we dig gently, not because we know, but because we don't. And in that uncertainty, in that hollow where knowledge should be, there is something sacred, too, a kind of humility, a reverence for what we cannot read. Sometimes, absence is the most honest thing history gives us. And so we catalog the soil, scan for magnetics, analyze for protein residues. We check isotopes, we carbon date, we map the shadows of what might once have been fire pits. But still, the silence of this place does not break. And perhaps it never will. Perhaps this was never meant to be interpreted, only remembered, not in words but in feeling. The way wind moves differently in a clearing of death. The way breath catches in the throat of someone standing over old bones, unsure why they feel like weeping. Maybe this too is ritual. Our ritual, the modern one, the act of wondering. Maybe that's all that's left. And yet, if memory can be held in ritual, and ritual can vanish without a trace, how much more have we already missed? Not far from the pit, just beyond the shallow curve of the valley, there are stones, not stacked, not built, not shaped into walls, but standing, quietly, waiting perhaps, or simply surviving. They rise out of the earth with no clear pattern, as if the land grew teeth and forgot to smile. Most of them are cracked, some lean, all bear the wear of centuries. But if you look closely, not with expectation, but with patience, a few bare markings. Lines, cuts, shallow scratches half swallowed by erosion. To an untrained eye, they are nothing, the result of weather, or of accidents. But the archaeologist kneels beside them with the same reverence they gave the bones. Because even stone, in its silence, sometimes speaks. The marks are not deep, not elegant. They do not form images, not clearly. They do not map to known languages. But they repeat, slightly, faintly, enough to catch the breath, like a stutter in the bedrock, like a whisper scratched in haste. And we begin to wonder, were they left for us? Or for someone else? Or for no one? Stone does not decay the way flesh does. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't rot. It doesn't forget in the same fragile ways. It weathers, yes, slowly, deliberately, like an old man turning his back on the world. But it doesn't vanish. And maybe they knew that. Maybe they chose stone not because they wanted to be remembered, but because they wanted to outlast forgetting. What if they knew their story would fade, that their tools would crumble, that their dwellings would fall? What if they placed these marks here not as monuments, but as anchors, not to declare what they were, but to ensure they weren't entirely erased? Because something in the human spirit resists disappearance. Even if we speak no language, we mark. Even if we build no cities, we gather. Even if we die quietly, we reach, not upward always, but outward, into time, into memory, into the stone. And yet, the problem is this: we don't know what the marks mean. Not because they're too complex, but because they might be too simple. A spiral, a slash, a series of dots, maybe a sun, maybe a wound, maybe nothing. Stone is honest, but it is not generous. It keeps its secrets in its skin, offering only the surface. Everything else, the hand that carved, the intention behind the line, the breath that followed the final stroke, is already gone. So we guess. We speculate. We say it could be a message, a warning, a story, a number, a map, or we say it's meaningless. Just geology pretending to be memory. But maybe it doesn't matter what it means. Maybe meaning was never the point. Maybe they carved because to carve was to be seen by time, to be acknowledged by the rock, to say, without language, I was here. And if that's all it was, a mark of presence, not purpose, is that not still memory? The stones don't tell us who they were, but they tell us someone was. That the pit was not the only place they touched, that their hands met more than earth, that they pressed something of themselves into the world and trusted the world to carry it forward. Even as rain softened the ridges, even as lichen bloomed across the edges, even as generations passed without noticing, the memory remains. Not sharp, not loud, but persistent, like a hum buried in wind, like a shadow cast by dusk instead of light. In other parts of the world, we've found such marks before. Petroglyphs, cup stones, carved paths, and standing rows. Some align with stars, some follow the sun, some seem random, until centuries pass and patterns emerge. And even then, we often do not know what they meant. We only know that they mattered, that someone stopped and carved and believed it was worth doing. And that belief, even without clarity, is a kind of sacredness. Because when the rest of the world falls apart, when wood returns to soil, when fire dies, when voices fade, the stone is still there, watching. So perhaps this outcrop is part of the story. Perhaps it isn't. Perhaps the marks are thousands of years older than the burial, or 1,000 after. Perhaps they were carved by wanderers who never knew the pit existed. Or perhaps they were made by the same hands that laid those children down. The same hands that braided hair, or sang lullabies, or prayed to a sky that no longer answers. We cannot know, but we can wonder. And in wondering, we preserve something too, a ritual of our own, a reverence for those who came before, even if we cannot read them, even if we cannot name them, even if all that's left is a notch in stone. The past does not require translation to matter. Sometimes all it asks for is pause, attention, a moment when we stop walking, stop speaking, and kneel beside a carved rock beneath a patient sky and breathe with it. Because something happened here, and maybe the stone remembers. And yet, if stone can hold memory longer than language, what else might it still be trying to say? Perhaps nothing. Or perhaps nothing we were meant to hear. The pit remains, still, unechoing, unnamed. Around it, tools have mapped its boundaries, brushes have cleared its edges, fingers have traced the contours of skulls that will never have names. There are no inscriptions here, no emblems, no sigils, no scratched identities, no offering bowls turned to stone. Just bone and dirt, just presence without narrative. We call it discovery, but is it really? What is found if it cannot speak for itself? The archaeologists catalog every detail, the angles of hips, the spacing of teeth, the lengths of femurs too small for adulthood. They sketch and scan and measure, seeking clues not in what is there, but in what's missing. They note the absence of grave goods, of tools, of clothing fibers, or ash layers, or pollen traces. They note the absence of difference, the sameness in posture, the silence of symmetry. No leaders, no outliers, no saints or sinners. Just people, small ones, maybe children, maybe not. And the longer they look, the stranger it feels. Not because the bones resist understanding, but because they seem untouched by time's typical fingerprints. This isn't a battlefield. It isn't a village. It isn't an accident, or at least not one that left the usual evidence. This is a hush, a pause in the sediment wrapped in bodies. And the question grows louder, not quieter. Why were they here? No names, no language, no story. Their anonymity is complete. We might think of that as failure, as a void in our data, a wound in the timeline, a missing page in the record book of Earth. But maybe that isn't what it is. Maybe the anonymity itself is the artifact, because anonymity is not always absence. Sometimes it is intention. Sometimes it is protection. Sometimes it is the echo of a people who lived differently, not to be remembered, but to be left alone, not to be admired, but to be dissolved, not because they feared history, but because they did not build their lives around the idea that history mattered. What if the pit is not a clue, but a refusal? What if this is not the beginning of a forgotten civilization, but the boundary of one that never wanted to be known? It is so easy so human, to assume that what survives was meant to. That pyramids were built to impress the future. That texts were copied to outlive the tongue that first spoke them. That culture always pushes outward, upward, eternal. But maybe that's our illusion. Maybe the greater part of humanity lived horizontally, close to the ground, close to the sky, close to silence. Maybe they whispered, not because they feared being heard, but because they had no need to shout. And when they died, they did not ask to be remembered. They simply became part of the dirt. And we call that strange. We mark it as anomaly. We say, something is wrong here. Something's missing. Something must have gone awry. But what if it didn't? What if this is the most deliberate site of all? A monument not to what happened, but to what was never meant to be found. Because even now, after all our scanning, all our modeling, all our isotope testing and carbon dating and DNA sequencing, we still do not know who they were. We have no names, no kin, no origin, no end. We cannot link them to tribes or languages or known routes of migration. We cannot fold them into a broader myth. And so, instead, they remain them, not characters in a story, but witnesses of silence. They don't explain themselves, and maybe they never could, because explanation is a kind of performance. And this, whatever this was, is not performance. It is presence, quiet and entire. We sift for pattern. We long for reason. But sometimes, history is not a puzzle. It is a mirror without reflection, a voice that ends mid-sentence, a poem never meant to rhyme. Maybe the pit is not for us. Maybe we are intruders, brushing against a mystery not meant to be solved. Not because it hides something, but because it is something, an absence, so whole it forms its own kind of memory. And isn't that, in the end, what an artifact truly is? Not a thing we understand, but a thing that stays. And yet, if this much can survive without a name, what else might be watching us, even now, from the cracks in our understanding? We look down into the pit, and it does not blink. There is no gaze, no voice, no invitation, and yet we come. Some drawn by science, some by sorrow, some by something quieter still. A hum we cannot name, a pull we cannot explain. They are unclaimed. That much is clear. No descendant stands vigil. No ancestor has stepped forward in soil or song. They're not in our genealogies, not in our myths, not in the folds of parchment or the rhythm of prayer. No one leaves flowers. No one speaks their names aloud at sunrise. No one dreams of them and wakes with tears. And still we return, brushes in hand, questions in mind, hearts tilted toward a story we do not understand. Because even in forgetting, something remains. Even in absence, there's form. Even the unclaimed can be inherited. Maybe not in the legal sense, not in property or name, but in burden, in mystery, in memory shaped by silence. Maybe when no one mourns the dead, the living inherit more than they know. Is that what we're doing here? Grieving for strangers? We're claiming them in the only way we can. Not because we knew them, but because they were people. Not because we owe them, but because the earth gave them back. We study the dead for knowledge. We say, for clues, for insight. But sometimes, quietly, softly, without announcement, curiosity becomes something else. Something reverent, something sacred, something shaped not by data, but by tenderness. A careful hand on a crumbling jaw. A whispered apology to bone. A breath held before lifting a skull no one asked to be disturbed. Is this mourning? Or something deeper? Perhaps the urge to know them is itself a form of mourning. Not of their loss, but of the possibility that they might vanish completely. That they might fall through the cracks, not only of time, but of meaning. That no one would care. And so we care. We become their witnesses, not because we saw, but because we listened. We become their memory, not because we remember, but because we imagine. And in imagining, something soft begins to form. Not a story, not yet, but a shape, the shape of humanness. Fragile, voiceless, incomplete, but still there, still them. And what we inherit is not certainty, but weight. The weight of wonder, the weight of not knowing and loving anyway. Maybe this is the real inheritance, The ache we carry for lives that brush the earth so lightly they barely left a mark, and yet stir something deep in us now. Not because they taught us, but because they trusted the ground more than the pen. Because they lived without legacy and vanished without spectacle. Because they were not trying to be remembered. And yet, we remember. Even if not by name. Even if not by deed. We remember in the way we touch their space. In the hush that falls over the site at dusk. In the pause between sentences, when no new theory seems enough. We remember in the ache of trying and the surrender of failing. Because maybe the inheritance isn't clarity. Maybe it's confusion. Maybe we do not receive answers, but questions that echo across generations. Who were they? Why here? Why together? Were they family? Were they afraid? Were they buried or placed? Did they believe in anything? Did they laugh? And if we cannot know, can we still care? Can we care without proof? Can we mourn without myth? Can we love the anonymous? The unclaimed? The lost? And if we can, maybe we already have. Maybe the pit belongs to all of us now. Not because we need it, but because we are changed by it. Because to kneel beside the bones of the unnamed is to remember that we, too, will someday be unnamed. That time will take our records, our ruins, our reasons. And perhaps someone else, long from now, will wonder what we meant, what we hoped for, what we feared, and they will not know, but they will feel. And maybe that feeling will be enough. Because in the end, history is not built only from facts, but from reverence, from attention, from the soft inheritance of those who listen to silence as if it speaks. And yet, if even the unclaimed can be remembered, what other kinds of memory might we still carry without knowing? If an entire generation can disappear into the soil, vanish without record, without marker, without even a whisper through time, what else might lie forgotten? Not destroyed, not erased, just asleep, beneath us, around us, within us. Because loss is not always loud. Sometimes it settles like dust on the skin of the earth. Gentle, reluctant, unnamed. It doesn't always look like ruin. It can look like an untouched field, or an empty plain, or a quiet bend in a river. Places we pass without pause, never knowing that once, long ago, someone stood there and hoped. A burial site that became a forest. A road worn down to root and stone. A language whose last syllable was spoken to no one. And if this much can be lost, not through violence, but through stillness, how much more have we already stepped over? Stepped on? Stepped past? Maybe the question isn't what we know. Maybe it's what never reached us. Because history is not only made of what happened. It's made of what survived. And survival, we know, is uneven, arbitrary, cruel. Fire chooses what it burns. Water chooses what it carries. Time chooses what it keeps. And the rest becomes potential. Possibility. Silence that could mean anything or nothing or everything. A ritual forgotten is not a ritual undone. It still lived once, deeply, beautifully, before it slipped beneath the waves of memory. A child buried without a name is still a child who lived. An empire crumbled without records still cast its shadow over seasons. They mattered, even if we cannot say how. And so the pit is not just a grave. It's a threshold, one that opens onto something wider. A question with no fixed edge. A sadness we didn't know we inherited. A story that does not unfold, but lingers. And maybe that's the point. Maybe some stories aren't meant to be told, but felt. Not because they are sacred, but because they are unfinished. Not because they were forgotten, but because they are still becoming. We search the earth for answers, but the earth does not answer. It only remembers. In layers, in shadows, in scars that look like stone. And sometimes we read those scars wrong. We mistake erosion for intent. We take coincidence for pattern. We build a story from a ruin and call it truth. But what if the truth isn't in the ruin at all? What if it's in the absence? What if the things we've lost hold the shape of what we've become? Maybe we are the aftermath of 1,000 untold stories. Maybe everything we call civilization is built atop the forgotten. Not because we ignored them, but because the past is heavier than we know. Because the earth folds over memory again and again, like pages sealing a book no one ever finished writing. And still something speaks. A trace of bone, a ripple in isotope, a discoloration in soil, a silence that hums louder than sound. Something is trying to reach us, not in language, but in presence, not in explanation, but in feeling. And if this much can be lost, the children, the tools, the meaning, what remains beneath our feet right now? Still waiting? Still sleeping? How many stories have we paved over? How many bones beneath cities? How many languages under lakes? How many hopes buried in silence, so complete it feels like the end, and yet might only be the middle? Could it be that forgetting is the default state of time? That memory is the anomaly? That everything we know, every name, every date, every temple and tablet and tale is a fragile rebellion against the gravity of loss? Maybe, maybe not. But here, in this moment, in this pit beneath this sky, we are reminded the past does not belong to the past. It breathes through us. It bends our maps. It haunts our timelines. It asks questions we do not know how to answer and still demand we try. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest act of history is not in discovery, but in listening, in pausing, in kneeling beside a place where lives once were, and whispering, I see you. I don't understand, but I see you. Because if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? And if we have forgotten, is it too late to remember? Or are some stories still waiting for someone to care enough to listen?